The saloon was alive with whispers the night she walked in, her hand resting against the swell of her belly. The pregnant mistress carried herself like a queen, certain that she had won the battle for the rancher's heart. Pride glimmered in her eyes as she looked down on those who once mocked her, as if her future was now secured. In a land where power was measured by bloodlines and inheritance, she believed that the child she carried gave her an untouchable claim. The crowd watched with mixed awe and envy, convinced that her path was now paved in victory. But the West had a cruel way of humbling pride. In the back corner, silent as a shadow, sat an orphan boy no one paid attention to. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed, and his gaze steady in a way that unsettled those who looked too long into his eyes. He had grown up forgotten, overlooked by the very people who now celebrated her. Yet, unlike the mistress, he carried something stronger than pride. He carried truth. And in the Old West, truth was more dangerous than any six-shooter. The mistress smirked, her hand caressing her belly as though it were her crown. She believed the rancher's fortune and land would now belong to her child, that her position was secured beyond question. Those who had once whispered insults now offered her favors, their loyalty shifting with the wind. The air was thick with her triumph, and she reveled in every moment. But triumph in the West is often short-lived, and pride has a way of collapsing when least expected. The orphan rose slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. His steps echoed through the saloon as all eyes turned to him, confusion stirring in the crowd. No one expected the boy to speak. He was nothing more than a ghost of the past, a reminder of hardship that polite company chose to ignore. Yet when he opened his mouth, his words cut sharper than any blade. The silence that followed was heavier than gunpowder waiting for a spark. What the mistress had dismissed as insignificant now stood before her as the one thing she could not silence. The orphan's truth, hidden for years, was about to unravel everything she believed she had secured. In the Old West, secrets buried under dust always found their way back into the light. And this truth would prove that victory claimed too soon often ends in the deepest fall. The orphan stood tall in the flickering lantern light, his thin frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floor. For years, he had been treated as invisible, the boy no one bothered to claim. Yet now his presence carried a weight that unsettled every man and woman in the saloon. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was steady in a way that demanded silence. "You think you've won," he said, his eyes fixed on the mistress. "But the West remembers what others try to bury." The mistress stiffened, her smirk faltering. The room, once filled with laughter and murmurs of congratulations, grew uneasy. She tried to hold her ground, her hand tightening over her belly as though shielding herself from words sharper than bullets. "What can an orphan know of winning?" she sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. "You have nothing, no name, no claim. This child is the future." But her voice, for all its venom, trembled with the first flicker of doubt. The orphan took another step forward, his boots creaking against the floorboards. He had grown up watching, listening, learning the truths others thought he was too small to hear. Every insult, every whisper, every cruel smile had carved strength into his bones. "You carry a child," he said evenly, "but I carry a truth that no gold or land can silence. And when it is spoken, your crown will crumble before your feet." The saloon erupted into hushed gasps, the tension thick enough to choke. The rancher, seated near the head of the room, froze. His face drained of color as the orphan's words echoed like thunder. For too long, he had allowed shadows to linger, secrets to fester, and now the past was standing before him with fire in its eyes. Pride had blinded him, and now the very walls of his fortune seemed to shake under the weight of revelation. The mistress glanced at him, searching for reassurance, but found only fear etched into his jaw. The West was merciless with secrets. You could bury them beneath land, cover them with cattle, and hide them behind walls of wealth, but eventually they rose like ghosts in the night. And now, in the silence of that saloon, every soul sensed the same thing. The truth the orphan carried was about to change everything. The mistress's face hardened, though her eyes flickered with unease. "You are nothing," she spat, her voice louder now, trying to silence her own fear. An orphan clings to lies because he has no family, no legacy. My child is the only name that will matter when this land is passed down. Her words rang hollow, echoing with the desperation of someone clinging to a rope already fraying in her hands. Pride swelled her chest, but it could not hide the quiver in her tone. The orphan did not flinch. He had endured hunger, loneliness, and ridicule. Her words were nothing compared to the storms he had survived. He walked closer, his eyes never leaving hers, his voice low and certain. "You say I have no family," he said, "but blood does not always reveal itself in the cradle. Sometimes it is hidden, waiting for the day it cannot be denied." His gaze shifted briefly to the rancher, whose hands clenched tightly around his glass, the truth pressing against him like a drawn revolver. The rancher's heart thundered in his chest. He had spent years locking away the truth, convincing himself it would never surface. Yet here it was, walking toward him in boots scuffed by hardship, carried in the voice of a boy who looked too much like the past to be ignored. Sweat gathered on his brow, not from the heat of the room, but from the weight of exposure. The mistress, noticing his fear, realized too late that the ground beneath her victory was cracking. The crowd shifted, eyes darting between the boy and the mistress, between pride and truth. They had come to celebrate, to drink, to laugh, but now they found themselves witnesses to a reckoning. The West thrived on spectacle, and nothing drew sharper breath than secrets unveiled. The silence became unbearable, every whisper of wind outside the saloon drowned out by the pounding anticipation within. The orphan stopped only a few feet away, his presence undeniable, his words hanging like a noose in the air. "I am not nothing," he declared, his voice unwavering. "And tonight, the truth will prove it." The mistress's confidence cracked as the boy's words struck the room like a hammer. Her hand trembled against the curve of her belly, though she tried to mask it with a scoff. "Empty threats," she hissed, but her eyes betrayed her. The crowd leaned in, sensing blood in the water. In the West, pride was a shield, but once that shield split, no amount of bravado could mend it. Her smirk had faded, and in its place grew the tight-lipped fear of someone standing on sinking ground. The orphan's gaze never wavered. He had carried this truth for years, hidden in silence, waiting for the moment when it would matter most. His voice cut through the room like the snap of a whip. "This land you covet was built on lies, and the blood you mock runs deeper in these walls than you dare to imagine." His words were not shouted, but they rang with conviction, making the air heavy and electric. Every ear strained to catch each syllable, knowing that the next would change the course of the night. The rancher lowered his head into his hands, his chest heaving as if the weight of the world pressed down upon him. He had lived too long hiding the boy's origin, convincing himself that the truth could be buried beneath work and silence. But the boy's face, his eyes, his stance, was living proof of a story he had tried to erase. The saloon walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows whispering the one thing he could not deny. The orphan was more than a bystander. Murmurs spread among the guests, suspicion cutting like cold steel. They looked from the rancher to the mistress, from the mistress to the boy, each person trying to piece together the threads of a secret about to unravel. The West thrived on gossip, and here, beneath the glow of lanterns and the creak of wooden beams, they were witnessing a revelation grander than any gunfight. The silence became unbearable, thick as smoke before a fire ignites. The mistress's voice cracked as she turned to the rancher. "Tell them he lies," she demanded, her words sharp with desperation. But the rancher's silence was more damning than any confession. The boy stood taller, the weight of years pressing behind his words, and for the first time, the mistress's victory teetered on the edge of collapse. The boy's voice softened, but its power only grew. "I was left with nothing but scraps, raised in the shadows of this very ranch. In all those years, I wondered why fate cursed me to hunger and loneliness while others feasted. But I know now, it wasn't fate. It was choice." "Your choice," he said, his eyes piercing the rancher. The accusation fell like a thunderclap, shaking every soul present. The rancher's face, once hardened by years of labor and pride, crumbled in the lantern light. His shoulders sagged as though the weight he had carried in secret for too long had finally broken him. His lips parted, but no words came. The truth hung between them like the rattle of a snake in tall grass. Inevitable, dangerous, impossible to ignore. The crowd's eyes bored into him, waiting, demanding, needing confirmation. The mistress stepped back, her expression twisting between fury and fear. She had built her victory on the rancher's name, on the belief that his silence would always protect her position. But now, faced with the orphan's revelation, she realized her triumph was slipping away. The power she thought she held over the rancher's future shattered in an instant, leaving her exposed, her crown nothing but dust in the wind. The saloon, once filled with laughter, now trembled in silence. Men shifted uneasily in their chairs. Women clutched their shawls tighter, and even the pianist by the corner froze mid-note. All waited for the rancher to speak, to confirm or deny, to save or damn the mistress with his words. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes not just answers but reckonings. Finally, the rancher lifted his head, his eyes hollow but resolute. "He does not lie," he whispered, the words trembling yet undeniable. The room erupted with gasps. The mistress's face drained of color, and the boy's chest rose with the first breath of vindication he had ever known. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It stood in the open, and it demanded its place in the harsh, unforgiving land of the West. The mistress staggered backward as if struck, her hand clutching the edge of table to keep from collapsing. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a storm of voices clashing in disbelief and satisfaction. Her triumph, once paraded so boldly, had been torn apart in front of everyone. Pride had painted her untouchable, but now she stood stripped bare, the child in her womb no longer a crown but a question mark. Her gaze darted desperately between the rancher and the orphan, searching for an escape that no longer existed. The orphan, though young, carried himself with the strength of someone who had endured more than most men twice his age. He did not gloat, did not smirk at the mistress's downfall. Instead, his eyes burned with something deeper, justice, long denied and finally brought to light. "You thought my silence made me weak," he said quietly, though his words carried across the saloon. "But silence is only patience, and patience runs out." The rancher sat motionless, his confession still echoing in the rafters. For years, he had buried the truth under labor and wealth, convincing himself it was mercy to keep the boy in shadows. Now that silence was broken, and the weight of it crushed him more than the judgmental stares of his guests. He had been a man of the land, respected and feared, yet in this moment he was nothing but a father who had abandoned his blood. His shame was etched deep into his weathered face. The guests, once eager to celebrate the mistress's supposed victory, shifted their loyalty with the swiftness of prairie winds. Some looked upon the orphan with admiration, others with pity, but none could deny his claim now. The mistress's position, once secured by whispers of inheritance, crumbled beneath the solid rock of truth. The West had no tolerance for false crowns. Legacies were carved in blood, not in lies. The mistress tried to speak, her lips trembling with fury, but no words came. For the first time, her voice held no power. All the scorn she had poured upon others now poured upon her, the room's silence louder than her pride had ever been. She had thought herself untouchable, but in the Old West, victory claimed too soon was nothing more than a trap waiting to snap shut. The orphan turned to the rancher, his expression steady, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime in shadows. "I never wanted riches," he said. "I never wanted power. All I wanted was to be acknowledged." His words pierced deeper than any accusation, shaking the rancher more than the judgment of the entire town. The saloon, filled with rough men and weary women, fell silent, as though even the walls held their breath to hear what would come next. The rancher's wife, seated quietly in the corner, lifted her hand to her mouth in shock. She had long suspected her husband's secrets, but suspicion was easier to bear than truth spoken aloud. Her eyes moved from the orphan to her husband, and in that look was both betrayal and sorrow. She realized that the boy's presence was not an intrusion. It was a reflection of choices her husband had buried, choices that now stood before her, undeniable and alive. The mistress, desperate to salvage her pride, finally found her voice. "He's nothing but a mistake," she shouted, her words shrill, desperate. But the crowd recoiled at her venom. Even those who once envied her now turned cold, their faces hard with disdain. In trying to destroy the boy, she had destroyed herself. The West had no mercy for those who spat on truth once it had revealed itself. The orphan did not respond to her insult. Instead, he looked once more to the rancher, waiting, not for wealth, not for inheritance, but for words that had been denied him his entire life. The room grew still, the only sound the faint creak of a swinging lantern. The rancher's breath was heavy, his eyes filled with tears he could no longer fight. He knew that this was the moment that would decide not only the boy's future, but his own legacy. Finally, the rancher rose to his feet, his voice breaking but clear. "You are my son," he said, his words trembling yet powerful. The declaration fell like thunder, shaking every soul present. The mistress gasped, the crowd erupted in disbelief, and the orphan stood frozen, the weight of a lifetime of silence finally lifted. What had been denied him for so long had at last been spoken, and no power on earth could take it back. The mistress's face twisted with rage and desperation. She had entered the saloon certain of her triumph, certain that her child would secure her place forever. But with one sentence, the ground beneath her collapsed. The rancher's acknowledgment of the orphan as his son destroyed the image she had carefully built. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, and though she tried to hold her chin high, her eyes darted wildly, searching for allies that no longer stood by her side. The orphan's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. For so long, he had lived nameless, faceless in the eyes of the world, dismissed as nothing. Now, with the rancher's words, his identity shifted in an instant. He was no longer the orphan boy lurking in the shadows. He was blood. The truth he had carried like a burden was now spoken aloud, turning shame into strength. Yet, along with vindication came a new weight, expectation. The West was merciless, and names carried not only honor but responsibility. The rancher, trembling but resolute, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. His voice cracked as he addressed the crowd. "I was a coward," he confessed. "I denied my blood and let him live in shadows. No man should do such a thing. But tonight, I claim what is mine." His words, raw and broken, carried more power than pride ever could. The saloon, filled with hardened men and weary women, fell silent, humbled by the rare sight of a man laying down his arrogance. The rancher's wife sat pale, her heart caught between grief and reluctant admiration. Her husband's confession carved wounds into her, yet she could not deny the courage it took to finally speak truth aloud. She glanced at the boy and saw not a rival to her own children, but a figure carrying scars no child should bear. Pity and sorrow mingled in her heart, softening her gaze despite the turmoil swirling within her. The mistress, however, could not accept defeat. "This changes nothing," she cried, her voice sharp and frantic. "My child will still be the heir, and this orphan will never take my place." But her words rang hollow, falling flat against the rising tide of truth. For the first time, the power she had wielded with arrogance slipped completely from her grasp. The crowd no longer believed her triumph. They believed the truth. The orphan turned his eyes to the mistress, his voice calm, steady, and unshaken. "You thought carrying a child gave you victory," he said. "But family isn't a weapon, and blood isn't a crown to be stolen. The truth doesn't bend for pride." His words cut deeper than her insults ever could. In the silence that followed, her defiance cracked further, her composure unraveling before everyone. The rancher's wife rose slowly, her steps deliberate, her eyes fixed on the mistress. The room held its breath, waiting for her reaction. She stopped only a few feet away, her voice soft yet sharp as steel. "You came into this house with lies and pride. But what this boy carries is not a claim. It is truth. And truth cannot be undone by your schemes." The guests leaned closer, their faces lit with anticipation. For them, this was not just scandal, it was justice unfolding. The mistress's cheeks burned with humiliation as whispers surrounded her, each murmur another dagger, cutting into the illusion of her victory. She tried to stand tall, but the weight of eyes upon her was crushing. The saloon that had once celebrated her now turned its back. Her isolation was complete. The very stage she had chosen to flaunt her triumph became the ground of her ruin. The rancher, his voice stronger now, declared, "This ranch will not be built on lies. It will not be passed through deceit. From this day forward, every child of mine will be known by truth, not by whispers or schemes." His words resonated with finality, carried by the authority of a man who had finally shed his cowardice. The orphan's head lifted higher, and for the first time pride, true pride, burned in his chest. The mistress looked around, but there was no salvation in the crowd. She realized, with the sharp clarity of a fall, that her power had been nothing but smoke. The orphan, once invisible, had risen to stand taller than her, not through wealth or cunning, but through truth revealed in the heart of the Old West. And in that land, nothing was stronger than a truth carried in silence until the right moment. The saloon doors creaked as the mistress stumbled toward them, her pride shattered and her allies gone. Each step she took was accompanied by whispers that followed her like shadows. The same voices that once cheered her now hissed with contempt. Pride had promised her victory, but the West never rewarded arrogance built on lies. By the time she reached the door, her face was pale, her eyes blazing not with triumph, but with desperation. She vanished into the prairie night, leaving behind the wreckage of her failed conquest. The orphan stood in the center of the room, his chest rising with heavy breaths. For years, he had carried the weight of silence, his worth denied by every glance, every insult. Now the truth had been spoken, and though it did not erase his scars, it gave them meaning. The boy who had once been nameless had become undeniable. The saloon, filled with those who had laughed at him, now bowed beneath the strength of his revelation. The rancher remained still, his hand trembling as it gripped the back of a chair. The truth had freed his son, but it had also condemned him. Every man in that room now knew he had lived a lie, hiding his blood in the shadows. The West valued honesty above all, and for a man to conceal his kin was a sin that would not easily be forgiven. His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened as he looked at the boy. In that moment, he silently vowed to carry the shame if it meant his son could finally walk in the open. The rancher's wife, her face pale but resolute, approached the orphan. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her heart torn between betrayal and empathy. She had not chosen this truth, but it had been forced upon her. She looked into the boy's eyes and saw pain, resilience, and blood that could not be denied. At last, she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You are part of this family now," she said quietly. Her words, though fragile, carried the strength of acceptance. The crowd, sensing the night had reached its end, began to disperse. Yet none would forget what they had witnessed. The mistress's downfall, the orphan's vindication, and the rancher's confession would echo across the prairie for years. In a land where reputations were currency, this truth would be remembered longer than gunfights or cattle deals. And as the lanterns dimmed, one thing was clear. The balance of power in the rancher's world had shifted forever. The orphan stepped outside into the cool night air, the prairie wind brushing against his face like a baptism of freedom. For the first time, he did not feel like a shadow lurking behind others. The stars stretched endlessly above him, vast and unyielding, and he felt as though they finally saw him. The West had given him nothing freely, but tonight it had given him a name, and in the Old West, a name was worth more than gold. The rancher followed, his boots heavy against the wooden porch. He looked at the boy, unsure how to bridge the chasm of years lost. Words seemed too small, apologies too hollow. Yet silence was no longer an option. "I cannot undo what I've done," he said, his voice raw. "But I can stand beside you now, if you'll allow it." His eyes pleaded with a vulnerability few had ever seen in him. The orphan studied him for a long moment, the weight of choice pressing on his young shoulders. He had every right to reject him, to spit back the years of abandonment. Yet as he looked at the weary man before him, he saw not just failure, but regret. Regret that was real and crushing. Slowly, he nodded, not with forgiveness fully given, but with the first step toward it. "Then stand," he said simply. From the window, the rancher's wife watched, her baby in her arms, her heart torn yet softened by the sight. The mistress had thought her womb was enough to claim the future, but tonight had proven otherwise. Blood alone did not secure a legacy. It was truth that bound it. And though her life had been upended, she knew that the family within those walls had become something both broken and whole, scarred yet strong. The prairie stretched vast and silent, carrying the echoes of what had been revealed. The West would test them again, as it always did, but the night's truth had carved a new path. A pregnant mistress who thought she had won was gone, and an orphan who carried silence had risen. In a land where pride often claimed victory, it was truth that had spoken last. The West was never gentle with pride, and this story proved it once again. A woman who believed her womb secured her future walked into the saloon, crowned with arrogance, only to leave it stripped of power. The mistress thought she had claimed victory, but truth has a way of unraveling false thrones. Her downfall was not sealed by bullets or fists, but by the quiet courage of an orphan who dared to speak. The orphan's words changed everything. For years, silence had been his prison, but patience gave him strength. When he finally spoke, his truth carried more weight than gold, more force than any weapon. In the blink of an eye, the boy the world dismissed became the living proof of a legacy denied. And through his courage, he reminded all who listened that the greatest victories come not from schemes, but from the endurance of truth. The rancher's confession was not just a revelation, it was a reckoning. A man who had hidden his blood for too long finally stood in the open, stripped of pride, but stronger in honesty. His shame became his redemption, and his acknowledgment of the boy was more than an act of courage. It was the breaking of chains that had bound them both. In that moment, the rancher learned that legacy is not secured by land or cattle, but by the courage to face the past. The guests who had gathered to mock or celebrate witnessed something far greater than scandal. They saw justice in its rawest form, the West's unshakable truth. You can hide secrets for years, but the prairie always remembers. And when the silence breaks, it does not whisper, it roars. That night would be told and retold, not because a mistress fell, but because an orphan rose, carrying truth like a torch that burned through the darkness. And now, as the echoes of this tale linger, the question rests on us. How often do we dismiss those who hold the truth we most need to hear? Pride may build walls, but truth always finds a way through. If this story stirred something within you, share your thoughts in the comments. What moment struck your heart the most? And if you want to keep walking these trails with us, through the dust and the shadows of the Old West, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. These stories live on because we carry them together, passing their lessons like fire across the prairie.